Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. And I want to welcome back to the show Joseph McBride, who is a film historian and a professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He is the author of biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg, 3 books on Orson Welles, and critical studies of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder, and the Coen brothers. He acted for Welles in The Other Side of the Wind and has won a Writers Guild of America award. And the focus of our discussion today is on his Frank Capra biography, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, and his follow-up, which is somewhat of a memoir, I felt, called Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra. Joseph, welcome back. It's great to have you again.
Great to see you, Robert. It's always a pleasure, and I really appreciate your really deep knowledge of film history. It's such a pleasure to have a good conversation with you.
Oh, well, me as well. And these, I mean, we touched on this before we started recording, but I was saying to Joseph, I feel like I know you so much better after spending a couple of months with these, fantastic books. And everything you went through, it's almost hard to believe in some ways that you went through such hell to get the story of Capra out there. But I'm looking forward to digging in. But I mean, right off the bat, I would love to ask, as you were finding out that Capra was, mostly his memoir is a pack of lies, and you were finding out this myth that he created about himself. Why personally for you, why was it important for people to know the truth about him, would you say?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because I was a big Capra fan, and in some ways I still am. The more I learned about him, the more deeply I appreciated his good work as a director, although his films are uneven and complex, and I mean, the complexity is part of what's interesting about them, and the contradictions. But, I was a very major Capra fan. And I, like most people, I really enjoyed The Name Above the Title, which came out in 1971, his autobiography. And I kind of naively believed it, like most people did, because it has a sort of an aura of self-critique. He's chastising himself from time to time, which lends credibility to somebody's account, because if they're completely defending themselves, you don't quite believe it. But what I found later was that he did that to hide deeper problems, that were not just discussed in the book. He has a cryptic line that he said, "Well, there are errors and omissions in the book, and it's one big error and omission, because I found out it's basically a novel about Hollywood. It's a rather engaging novel, but it's a fantasy. He rewrote his life as a Frank Capra film, and it's a part of his story. Why did he do that? But the only things that checked out pretty much were the date of his birth and the date that the ship left Italy for America. I checked both dates because, it was my first full-scale biography. I had done a short biography of Kirk Douglas before that, but the Capra book was a real deep dive. I really crossed every T and dotted every I that one could possibly do as a researcher. That was fascinating. I love research. But I learned very quickly, don't take anything at face value when you're doing a biography or any work of history. That's a good maxim. And I think too many writers of those genres take a lot for granted, and they don't question things. But I had to question everything, because I was kind of inventing the wheel of Capra studies, in a sense, because Capra was, as I found out, a conservative Republican who hated Franklin D. Roosevelt. And yet his films in the 30s were seen as kind of New Deal fables, celebrating the little guy against the system. And, people assumed that he was liberal and a Democrat. But the reason, 2 reasons they believe that. One was the films had a sort of a somewhat liberal tinge. But they also had some conservative elements. And even when I was believing the name above the title, there were things in there that were jarring that I couldn't quite understand. For example, I mean, the thing that really grabbed me in that book, he talks about in 1951, he was sent to India by the US government to represent American filmmaking at a film festival. And India was a very important non-aligned nation, as they called it back then. It wasn't part of the American sphere of influence or the Soviet. And so Nehru and the Indians were people that we worked hard at being allied with. And so Capra's job was to go over there and attack communists at this festival, or people he saw as communists. And so there's a strident passage in his autobiography. It seems like a different person all of a sudden emerges. He's lambasting communists in very simplistic terms. I thought, gee, that's kind of jarring. I wonder, when you're a journalist, as I am since 1960, you kind of look for cracks in the story or things that don't add up. And I kind of made a mental note, like, what is this scene? I mean, is this guy not exactly who he seems to be? But a big turning point for me was 1975. I was on Variety, Daily Variety, from 1974 onward. And I made it my mission back then to interview all the directors and other people in Hollywood who I admired, as many as I could. And it was a great place to do that because in those days you had the cachet and you could call up almost get anybody on the phone and go on sets of films. And now it's really hard to do that because it's become more corporate and they really control the publicity much more. But anyway, so I interviewed Howard Hawks for 7 years and did the book Hawks on Hawks. And I found, most of the directors that I admired were very accessible. And, I got Capra on the phone and he said, come on down. And so I had lunch with him in Palm Springs at a posh country club that he belonged to, which was a bit of different from his image as the man of the people. And when I went to his house in La Quinta, which is a suburb of Palm Springs, he had this huge American flag over the house, which was interestingly symbolic because there was nobody more truly patriotic than Frank Capra in many ways. And he told me it was the flag that flew over the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, and Walt Disney had given it to him. And I met Mrs. Capra, Lou, who was a very nice lady, and Frank Capra and I got in a little golf cart and we drove to the country club, which is next to a golf course. And so we're sitting there having lunch, and Capra was giving me his rap about how he hated bankers and rich people. And what happened when his book came out, he went around to 125 or so college campuses and became a very popular speaker. The students really liked him. He was very charming in many ways and very funny. But he was kind of presenting himself as anti-establishment liberal, and the students ate it up, And so he was, I hate bankers and rich people. And then this man came over with this bunch of photographs and put them on the table. He said, Frank, here are the pictures of you playing golf with President Ford. And yeah, so we're sitting there looking at these pictures, and they were terrific pictures. And one was President Ford was putting, and Frank Capra was putting and the president was holding the pin, which I thought was the ultimate immigrant success image. The president of the United States holds the pin. I used to be a golf caddy, and I thought, wow, he's your caddy, right? Gerald Ford. And Capra was saying, oh, Jerry Ford, he's such a nice guy, so funny. He said, the ball goes all over the place. Ford had this reputation of hitting wild golf swings. He hit some guy in the head with a golf ball and stuff. And Capra, anyway, he just was in heaven. And he was saying, oh, wonderful. And the guy said, I'll make copies for you, Frank. So then the guy left, and Capra turned to me and he said, where was I? I said, oh, I was telling you how I hate bankers and rich people. And then he launched back into his whole routine. And the red flag of a journalist went up, and I thought, this guy is not who he seems to be. He's putting on an act. And I made a mental note, find out more. And eventually I did.
And, it's interesting because, we did looking at you also wrote this biography later on John Ford, and I read your other John Ford book with Michael Wilmington, which is more of a critical study, but you're certainly very interested and care deeply about uh, the fact that often the myth is what people know, and that they don't. The truth is print. What is the famous quote? Print the myth and not the legend.
Yeah, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. The editor says, the newspaper editor says in Liberty Valance. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The man who shot Liberty Valance. And so I can see from knowing that about you that I could see why this was important for people to know the truth about Capra. But you also talk about how it really helps to, the more you know about the artist, the more you will be able to understand the films. And so can you talk a little bit about why that is, why we have more insight into his films as a result of knowing the truth about him?
Yeah, that's another very rich question, because one thing I've found over the years is a lot of people, unlike you, they don't understand the difference between a biography and a critical study.
Right.
And a critical study is a study of the work, and primarily the work. And you use biographical information sometimes to help illuminate the work. But I mean, there's a whole kind of school of thought, especially in academic writing, that the author is not that important. And it's kind of ironic, because the whole authorship question has been a big debate in film studies for decades. The French designed the politique des auteurs, the policy of authors, to indicate directors who that they admired and they wanted to study. And they kind of felt that, like, the least work of Jean Renoir is better than the best work of some hack director they didn't like. But Andrew Sarris, when he imported it to America, the French, one of the things they were doing, Truffaut and Godard and Romer and Chabrol, those guys who later became important filmmakers, they were helping account for directors who didn't write their scripts, like say George Cukor, who I just wrote a book about George Cukor's people acting for a master director. He was faithful to the text. He took great pride, and he felt responsible to the text, and he chose, terrific plays and other works to adapt, and had great screenwriters. And so some people, in America think, well, Cukor maybe wasn't an author because he didn't write his own movies. That's a fallacy that the French critics didn't fall into. They were accounting for people like Cukor and Walsh, but also people who they thought were not screenwriters, but actually did work on scripts, such as Hawks and Hitchcock and others who really worked on, and Lubitsch worked on the scripts behind the scenes, but didn't take credit. I once asked Howard Hawks, I said, in some of his early films, he takes writing credit with other people. And I said, why did you stop doing that? And he said, well, I found that if I put my name on the script, I couldn't get such good writers to work with me. And that was really wise, and that's why he had great writers working with him throughout his career. But Capra started as a screenwriter. I found in his papers at Wesleyan University, I read all his early attempts to write screenplays, which were not particularly good. There were a couple that were interesting, but he didn't really have any success as a writer until he became a gag writer for Hal Roach, but even more for Max Sennett. He wrote 25 films for Max Sennett, and some wonderful scripts, comedy scripts. He found his voice, okay, so Capra he believed in this thing called one man, one film, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard that. He popularized that phrase to indicate that one man makes a film, or one person. And he wanted to claim that the writers were not very important to him. And he infamously, dissed Robert Riskin, who was his major writer, who really contributed a great deal to his work. And as a matter of fact, I felt that Riskin is more the author of Capra's films than Capra was, which is an interesting paradox. But Capra was a great director in certain ways that directors are. For example, he was a great actors director. I felt that was his major talent. He was wonderful with actors. He brought out the best in a lot of people and helped uh, get certain people started and build their careers, like Barbara Stanwyck and all kinds of other people. And but he was not a great visual stylist. He relied on Joseph Walker, who shot 20 of his films. And I found, the films before Walker came along in 1926 are visually undistinguished. And then after 1946, when Walker stopped working with him, they revert to being visually undistinguished. But the Walker films have this gorgeous romantic glow and complexity visually. And so Capra but he was very insecure about his authorship because he started as a writer. As I said, he was kind of a failed screenwriter. And so he wanted to be a writer. And he said to me once, he said, directing a film is almost as important as writing a book. I thought that was an interesting admission. He really admired great authors. And one of his passions in the 1930s, he was a collector of rare books and manuscripts. He had this amazing collection. And they published a catalog even of his books. He sold them in a fit of pique once when he was mad at his screenwriters. He said, I hate these books. And he sold these things. He had, for example, Charles Dickens's proof copy of A Christmas Carol. I mean, wow.
Oh my God.
And he had amazing stuff. So he really admired, Dante and Dickens and all kinds of fabulous writers. But he knew that he wasn't in their league. And so he promoted directorship as a big thing. He hired a publicist named Scoop Conlon, who most people haven't heard of, but Scoop Conlon actually wrote an autobiography. And he says that he and Capra cooked up this whole idea of the director as author back in the 1930s and promoted it.
Oh, wow.
And so the Capra's fans bought this, and then screenwriters and other people started saying, well, he's unfair to Riskin. And then Capra's crew guys, who I interviewed, who really knew Capra well and how he worked, I started by interviewing them. They said, we thought it was so unfair to Joe Walker in his book. He has a very passing mention of Joseph Walker, and his importance to Capra was immense. And we didn't like the fact that one of Capra's crew guys said, we knew a different man. When he was in his prime, he was a good collaborator. He valued his crew. They were loyal to him, and he took ideas from them. And, he said to me, if some crew guy comes up to you and has an idea and you put it into the film, the director gets the credit. So why not take the idea from? I mean, that's smart, and that's filmmaking. I saw Orson Welles do that on the other side of the wind. The best directors work well with other people, but at a certain point, Capra's ego couldn't handle it. And I'll just tell you one little tale. And in 1939, when he made his greatest film, in my view, and also he told me, it's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is really my best film. He usually told people it was It's a Wonderful Life, but he really secretly thought it was Mr. Smith. His mother was this hard-headed Italian immigrant lady, very, very tough, Sarah Capra, and she supported the family through thick and thin in the early days. And his father was kind of a romantic ne'er-do-well who played the guitar and hung around and talked to his friends and didn't work very hard. But the mother was dynamic, like a lot of immigrant women hold the family together, But she was tough, and Capra said something to me that was very sad. He said, I loved her. But he said, she didn't like me at all, but I loved her. I can hear his voice say that. It's so emotional. Can you imagine? She didn't like me at all, but I loved her. And so he's always trying to win his mother's approval. And she never understood what a director did. He said she wondered, well, what do you get all that money for just sitting in a chair on the set? She didn't get it. She had no idea. So when Mr. Smith came out, he said, I went all out to impress my mother. I got a limousine, had a special screening on the Columbia lot. And when she got out of the car, we gave her a bouquet of roses, and she sits down, watches this movie. And then when it ends, he turns to her and says, well, Ma, what did you think? And she said, Frankie, when are you going to get a job? I mean,
I love that story. Did he tell, because I saw him tell that in an interview years ago. Was that, I think that was on Cavett, wasn't it? I don't know if you
oh,
remember.
it probably, I didn't know that offhand, but I spent a
Yeah,
year interviewing him for the book,
right.
and I really, a lot of the time I was really focusing on his youthful. Just let me just get a quote here, if you could hold on one
Yeah,
second.
yeah, sure.
This is a biography of Ulysses S. Grant by Michael Korda, who writes his epigraph for this book. He said, General Grant, President Grant said, I read but few lives of great men because biographers do not, as a rule, tell enough about the formative period of life. What I
Mm,
want to know is what a man did as a boy. And I
right.
did that. I really, really went to town and interviewed as many people as I could find who knew him growing up. And what formed this guy, because he was pretty well formed by the time he got out of college. And when I started doing the book, most film biographies were pretty sketchy, especially in the early years. You know, they seemed like impatient to get through the years before the person becomes a star or director. And there'd be like, 10 pages on the first 25 years of somebody's life or something.
Right.
And I was influenced by Justin Kaplan's biography, Mr. Clemens and Mark Twain, which is early part of Mark Twain's life, and Robert Caro's first volume of his Lyndon Johnson book, which came out in 1982. He spends, I don't know what it is, maybe 40 pages before Johnson shows up in the book. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but he spends an awful lot of time on the women in the hill country of Texas and how they didn't have electricity, and Johnson brought electricity to that area, and all kinds of fascinating stuff. And then he goes through his early years, and I thought, well, that's what a real biography does. So I set out to do that. And somebody at the AFI, while I was writing the book, I heard that they said I'm revolutionizing film biography, and I don't know how they knew that, because I kept very quiet about the book, very stealthy.
Hmm.
But since I did that book, now people like Pat McGilligan, my friend, wrote a wonderful biography of Orson Welles called Young Orson, which covers the first 24 years of his life and ends when he says action on Citizen Kane. And it's
Oh,
like
right.
700 pages long. And Welles doesn't show up for like 125 pages or something. He had these
Oh,
fabulous
wow.
parents, and Pat found out stuff that nobody knew. But,
Mm,
one thing I found out, there's a tremendous amount on all of us out there in paper trail, if you know how to dig it out. And also people, the other thing about film biographies, the last thing I'll say about this is, I saw they would interview 8 or 10 people, and they were usually movie stars. And stars are they know the least about how a film is made, because they come in for a certain period of time. They're not there all the time like the crew people are. And they're narcissistic, and they just think about themselves, and they're not really paying attention to other people. But I interviewed the so-called ordinary people in Capra's life, his neighbors and his pals growing up, and the people he went to high school with, and people he went to grade school with, and guys he went to college with at Caltech, when it was still called Troop Institute of Technology. So I interviewed all these people that were ignored by film biographies, and those people gave me tremendous material in the interviews. Girlfriend in college.
mm.
He denied having a girlfriend in college, but I found her, and she was just a terrific interview. Anyway, yeah, that's kind of part of the process.
Well, I really appreciated that you did that, because as deeply flawed as he was, I never disliked him in the book. And I felt that you really came from a place of empathy and compassion. And I thought, all these terrible things he did, like, credit hogging and naming names during the Blacklist period, which I didn't know that until
Mm.
it's well known that Kazan did that, of course, but I didn't know that about Capra. And he was racist, and he was ashamed of his Italian heritage, and so many things. I just thought, oh my god. But then at the same time, I never felt I disliked him. It was,
Yeah, yeah.
it's pretty impressive that
Well, I'm glad
you managed to do that.
I'm glad you said that, Robert, because the thing that the book had very gratifying, good reviews. But the comment that really meant the most for me back then, John Sanford was a writer I knew who was he was a communist. His whole life, he died at, I think, 99 years old. He was still a communist. Esquire called him the last communist in America. He was a very stubborn guy, and he was blacklisted. But he worked on Capra's Why We Fight films, and his wife, Marguerite Roberts, was an important screenwriter, and she was blacklisted. So he told me he hated Capra, but he said, when I read your book, and he gave me terrific interview material for the book, but he said, I felt a sense of pity for him, like you do in a tragedy. That's right. What Aristotle says in a classic tragedy, you feel pity for the character who destroys himself. And we recognize our common humanity with that person through the flaws, which we all have flaws, but that's why you write a tragedy. Capra's life was a great American tragedy, and it's a great story. So, I mean, as a journalist, I thought, wow, this is a great story.
Yeah.
Especially when I found out he named names, which was a real shock. But it wasn't a complete shock when I found that out, because of this revelation in his autobiography that he was a strident anti-communist in 1951, when the Blacklist was getting really pervasive in Hollywood. But he was a charming fellow, and he was very admirable in many ways to start off with a relatively humble life, although he exaggerated how humble it was. But he worked his way through school. But for example, I mean, you have to qualify everything with Capra when he basically says in his book, this is another shameful thing, that his family didn't support him going to college, but in fact his mother and his sister Anne was a seamstress, and his mother worked in a canning factory, and they gave him money and stuff to help him get through school, and he doesn't recognize that in the book. It's terrible. He implies that he did it all himself all the way through his life, and but he was a guy who realized very smartly that education was the key to success in America as an immigrant. And I've been a teacher now for 22 years, and I bear that in mind, because the heroes of my Frank Capra book, well, there are three teachers who I found that were indispensable to him. There's a lady named Jean McDaniel who taught him in grade school, and she was a tall Irish unmarried lady who wore these tall boots in class, and she was a terrific teacher. And she used to take little Frank aside and say, go on to high school, go on to high school. And in those days, most people didn't even go to high school. They had to go to work.
Right.
And in fifth grade, well, there was an amazingly touching story. There are a couple times when I read the book, I actually cry. And one of the moments is when Jane McDaniel recalled that in fifth grade, Capra was looking over the shoulder of the kid in front of him all the time. And she said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, I have no book, Miss McDaniel. His parents didn't buy books for him. So she talked to the parents, and they said, we're going to pull him out of school after fifth grade to make him go to work in a brickyard, which was the kind of thing immigrants did in LA. And his brother, Tony, did that. Tony became kind of a petty criminal bootlegger kind of guy, and Frank could have wound up like that. And so Miss McDaniel got the PTA at this school to raise money to give to Capra's parents to pay him what he would have earned in the brickyard, so he would stay in school, because she recognized this as a really smart kid, And without her, we never would have heard of Frank Capra. I mean, seriously. So he said she would grab him on the playground, kept saying, go to high school, go to high school. So he did go to high school, and there he met a guy named Rob Wagner, who was his teacher in various ways. And he was an extraordinary fellow who was a screenwriter already for the Max Sennett Studios, and he was a friend of Will Rogers and Charlie Chaplin. I mean, he was well connected, and he was a political radical, and I think he had a lot to do with Chaplin becoming a left winger, and the FBI was investigating Rob Wagner early on. And he started a magazine, Rob Wagner's Script. He had a radio show, but he was writing a series of articles when Capra was at Manual Arts High School. Wagner was writing articles for the Saturday Evening Post on how to break into the movies. And so he's responsible for Frank being interested in movies. And Wagner gave him advice on how to break into movies. And that's, Capra claimed he didn't know anything about movies until he walked off the street in San Francisco in 1921. He said, I saw an ad in the paper, a director was wanted for a short film, and I went in there and bluffed my way in, but I didn't know anything about movies. That's just a complete lie.
Right.
I found it, for example, a 9-page essay he wrote at Troop, which later became Caltech, and it was 1917, and it was about the history of motion pictures, and it was a very savvy article. I mean, essay. It dealt with the technological aspects of film, which Capra was very interested in because he was at a technical school. It dealt with the moral aspects, as he called them, and the literary aspects, and it was a pretty knowledgeable essay on film in 1917. And the longest and hardest research I did was into his apprenticeship before he became a director. But the third teacher who meant a lot to him was Clinton Kelly Judy was his name. He was a teacher at Troop, and he was the English teacher at this technical school. And I interviewed 18 men who went there, and he was their favorite teacher. All these guys who became engineers and scientists, they said Mr. Judy was the guy we liked best because he had us all write short stories. And one guy was sort of laughing. He said, "Wow, you should have heard some of those stories. We read them in class, and they were so awful." But he said, "We're engineers, and we learned about English, and we learned about literature." And Capra said, through Mr. Judy, I discovered poetry at Caltech. Can you imagine? And he brought the famous poet Alfred Noyes, English poet, to be poet in residence there, and Capra started writing under the influence of Judy, although there's some evidence he may have even done some writing for Max Sennett when he was in high school. But Rob Wagner quite clearly was the guy who got him work at Roach and Sennett because he worked for both of those places. But again, Capra, I don't think he even mentions some of these people in his book, and he certainly doesn't say that Rob Wagner helped me get work in Hollywood, But anyway, so teaching and education, Capra says in the book, education was my pole vault out of the ghetto, as he called it. But, another huge myth about Capra, but these myths die hard. A lot of people believe it, that he came from an Italian ghetto in Los Angeles, and it was all Italian people, and he felt they were very provincial and blah, 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 blah. And I said to him, one of my first jobs was to find out where he grew up. And I said, where did you grow up exactly? And he didn't remember, which was kind of interesting. It's not that his memory was fallible, but he just didn't give a damn. And so I had to go to Washington to look up the 1910 census, which was the latest available at the time. And I printed out the census for East LA, where Capra lived. It's called Lincoln Heights. And first of all, I found out it wasn't just Italian people. It was a multi-ethnic place. Irish people, Italian people, German people, all kinds of people. So it wasn't an Italian ghetto. It was kind of a lower middle class area, and it wasn't a slum or anything like that. And then I did some research into the housing records in LA, and I found out the Capras owned 3 homes in Lincoln Heights. 3 homes. I mean, it was
no ghetto.
Yeah, I mean, Mrs. Capra working in the packing plant. It actually was one sort of big home, and then 2 little ones in the back, and right. They would rent one out, and then one of their relatives lived in the other. But they were not poor. And Tony Capra's widow told me when Tony read. She said, I read the name above the title to him. I guess Tony didn't read very well, but because he dropped out of school after 4th grade. And she said he would get really angry when Frank would say we were poor. He said, we weren't poor. What is this? And he threw the book against the wall at one point.
Oh, God.
And, so there's a whole complete lie about his origins that I really found fascinating. And I realized in writing this book, and it was true of Ford and Spielberg when I did their life stories, that I'm fascinated by how people get to where they are, right. famous people. How do you get into the profession, and who helped you, and what were your stepping stones, and the good luck you had and the setbacks. And also I found out there's a common characteristic of my 3 biographies that I hadn't realized at the time, which is ethnicity.
Right.
But they're all about people who kind of had to figure out a way of being accepted in American life or assimilated. Capra was an immigrant. Ford liked to claim he was born in Ireland, but he wasn't, but his parents were. And Spielberg was Jewish, and he was born in Cincinnati, and he lived in a very Jewish neighborhood called Avondale. But then when his father kept moving up in the computer field, this Spielberg's moved into more and more waspy areas,
Right.
until Northern California, which is the source of a lot of the trouble in Fabelmans, where he was abused for being Jewish. But actually, it's an oddity of the Fabelmans. He doesn't really portray anti-Semitism happening in Phoenix, where he spent really his most formative years, but there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism directed at him in Phoenix. And so he grew up being ashamed of being Jewish. Later, because he became a father and because he made Schindler's List, he embraced his Jewish heritage, and that was a very healthy thing. But Ford was always very proud of being Irish at a time when you were supposed to, and I remember this vividly, that you were supposed to melt down your differences in America and be part of the melting pot. In other words, we were all supposed to be homogenized Americans, whatever that is. And it's just bullshit, you know.
Right.
But it wasn't until Roots came along, Alex Haley, and the Black Power movement and things like that, people said you should be proud of your ethnicity. And Capra said, "Oh, that Roots guy, he's so full of shit. You know, people are so proud of their roots. It's sickening." Or, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, he rejected his roots. He rejected his family. He was very, very harsh toward his family. And I said to him, "When did you stop being ashamed of your parents?" He said, "I haven't yet."
God. Yeah.
I mean, my God. And I read a really interesting book published in 1919 called The Italian Emigration of Our Times. There were millions of Italians who came over in the 1890s and early 1900s. And it was the biggest wave of immigration after the Irish. Then the Italians came, and then a lot of Russian Jews came because of pogroms. But there's a huge number of Italians. And the author says that one of the very sad things about Italian immigrants and other immigrants that he studied was when the children become assimilated, they learn the language pretty fast, as Capra did.
Yeah.
They become ashamed of their parents, he said, because their parents have the old world accent and habits and stuff, and they want to break away from their parents. And then that's what Capra did. And I think it really destroyed him in the long run. You know?
Yeah, my mother may not like me saying this because my family's Italian, and I could certainly see, when I was reading the book, I could certainly see similarities with the need to be accepted and to shed your heritage to various degrees, which is such a shame. But the one you touched on when you were interviewing him for well over a year, and I was curious what it would be like. I mean, how were you feeling before asking him something, and then he lies, and then you break out the truth, the hard evidence right there that he's lying? I mean, were you nervous about those kind of confrontations, or how did here you are with a man you admire? I was curious just how did you handle it?
That's quite a story, but I'd like to hear a little bit about your background. Were your parents from Italy, or were they born in America, or what?
Well, my father was born in Canada, but his brothers and his parents were born in Italy. So, but as soon as they immigrated here, my father was born like 5 or 6 years later. So he's basically grew up with that strong culture and heritage. My mother was born in Italy, but she came here when she was actually almost 6, like Capra. So when I was reading the book, I can certainly see parallels of not feeling that you don't fit in society, but then you feel like you also don't fit in at home because you're caught between both worlds. So I thought it's very, very common. It's very common among immigrants, certainly.
Yeah, there was pressure on us in the 50s to kind of downplay our ethnicity, and my parents were always very proud of being Irish Americans. My mother was, well, we find out through ancestry.com and things, we're not 100% of anything, but my mother was really heavily Irish background. My father had some German and Czechoslovakian background and French even, but we were primarily Irish, and we were happy to think of ourselves that way. And that's one reason my mother, said that's why I like John F. Kennedy for president. She was she was vice chairman of the state Democratic Party in Wisconsin in the early Kennedy years, and she and the state chairman switched their allegiance from Humphrey to Kennedy, and that helped a lot. And so I worked for Kennedy as a volunteer. But I remember one day I was so big into being Irish, I asked my mother if I could get in the bathtub and pour green dye, food dye, into the bathtub and go to school green for St. Patrick's Day and color my clothes green. She said, no, she put her, that was going too far. But we were, we were proud of it. And that was not the common attitude, because, back then you were supposed to be embarrassed by your background, which is absurd, but it's a different world now. But Frank, came through that problem, but he looked down on his parents, and as I said, his mother never really understood what he did, or he tried to get through to her, and but she abused him too physically, and she was a tough lady. But she was. I mean, I admired his parents in a lot of ways. They were fascinating people. I love immigrant stories. I get very emotional.
Yeah, me too.
Any immigrant story, or movie.
Oh, me too.
Also, this guy who wrote the book on immigration that I read said that the people who come over are extraordinary people by definition, because they have the courage to leave their home, which it takes a lot of physical and emotional courage in those days. And also, he said, to have the imagination to see your life as better than the people around you. That's what all these people have in common. And that's one reason Capra had this monumental ego, because his parents saw better life in America, and they passed that on to him. And he had a remarkable brother, Ben Capra, a fantastic fellow who brought his family over. He sent them money for the trip and stuff. He worked for, a couple of years or whatever it was to get the money. And one thing I had, I interviewed a cousin, or a nephew of Frank Capra, named Joe Finocchio, who worked in the sound recording of Capra films. He was assistant to Edward Barons, who was Capra's sound guy, who was a great source of mine. He became a director later. He was the Three Stooges' favorite director, Ed Burns, wonderful guy. But Joe had interviewed Ben Capra and Tony Capra, Frank's older brothers, who had been dead for quite a while when I started my book. And Joe had an hour of interview with each guy. And those were priceless things, because Ben tells about coming to America, which is it's sort of like Kazan's America saga. And then he talks about bringing the family over. And another thing that gets me very emotional in the book is Ben said he was working as a ditch digger, if I'm remembering this correctly, at some college campus in Southern California. And he said, I saw all these students going to classes with books, and they weren't working. They were going to school. And he said, I began thinking, my brothers, Frank and Tony, I should bring them over so they could do that and get an education. And oh God, I mean, my heart goes out to it. And so this guy, Ben, made this possible. It's astonishing. And wow, without Ben, Frank Capra would be over in Italy as a night watchman in a grape arbor or olive arbor, like his dad was. He
had plenty of champions and help.
Yes, it takes a village to raise a Frank Capra.
Exactly.
And so he denied all these people, and that's part of his story and part of the tragedy.
Yeah, certainly. But just getting back to those interviews with him,
You're a good question. Yeah, that was a fascinating process, I'll tell you. Because, I had a good rapport with him in that interview we did in 75. And then, I would see him at a couple of Hollywood events and say hi to him and chat with him. But in 1981, I was writing the American Film Institute salute to Frank Capra. I wrote 5 of these AFI Life
I just
Achievement
saw it the
Awards.
other day because you can see it on YouTube. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah, it's great. You know, they all came out on, I wrote 5 of them. They all came out on not Blu-ray, but Laserdisc
Oh,
and tape. Actually, not. I don't think everyone is on Laserdisc, but my Fred Astaire show is, and the Lillian Gish program, and
I didn't know that.
John Huston show. But you know, Laserdisc was a good medium, but it's kind of hard to.
Mm.
You know, you could pick up a used Laserdisc player on eBay to watch it, and they came out on tape too, but. They're not available on DVD, unfortunately. I think it's a rights issue because the AFI would get film clips. The studios would let them use film clips for free, but they didn't have like, you know, long-term perpetual use of these clips, and that's unfortunate. But anyway, they were great experiences for me as a young writer because I got to work with all these stars and directors that young writers never worked with. I was in my 30s, and so I was doing the Frank Capra tribute. I had done the Jimmy Stewart tribute the year before, and Capra was on that, and I got to know him a little bit better. And so I was doing the Capra show, and that's when I got to know Capra really well because George Stevens Jr., my collaborator and producer of the show, he said, the show will rise and fall on the strength of Capra's speech. And he said, he's not a good public speaker. And so it's your job to make sure that he gives a terrific speech. So I spent 2 months with Capra writing and rehearsing his acceptance speech. And it was wonderful, a wonderful speech.
Yeah, he did a great job.
He did a great job.
Yeah.
Part of it was he was very enthusiastic, and we rehearsed it. And I would go down to La Quinta, and we'd have dinner, and he understood the virtue of rehearsing, and he worked hard. He said, I want this to be important because it's the end, is what he said. You know, it's his final thing. And one thing, when he was on the Stewart show, he would look down like this at his notes, and he was bald or balding, as you can see in this picture here. And so we'd see this bald head and these glasses, and you couldn't see his eyes very well. And George said, we got to do something about the camera angle. So I devised a kind of low angle shot so we could see his eyes better. And also I said, for the first time, and then we did this every year, I said, let's record his speech in the afternoon as a insurance in case he gets flustered in front of, it's 2,000 people,
right?
Overwhelming emotion and in this hot room and all that. And I said, well, if founders in the speech, we can cut to the video. And we did that, and it was seamless, but we wound up not using a lot of the tape because he was really good in the room. He got energized with the crowd, and he made a few ad libs that were very terrific, but so I got to know him well, and I would be asking him a lot of questions, taking notes and things, and finding out discrepancies between the reality and his book. And my interest was growing as a journalist, thinking, well, there's a story here. Maybe there's a book in this, maybe there should be a biography of Frank Capra. But I also got to know people who knew him, like Claudette Colbert and Jean Arthur, who was, my favorite actress, who's reclusive, and Capra got me in to see her, and we became friends. And then Jimmy Stewart, I got to know, and they were telling me quite a different story from what we all thought Capra was. And so when I did I didn't get around to doing the book until 1984. I kind of was, I was thinking myself as a screenwriter, and I had written books since the 60s, but my main focus then was writing films and TV scripts. And I was getting really disenchanted with that because Hollywood treats screenwriters very badly. And I had success, but it was not a pleasant job, except for those AFI shows. Those were pretty much fun. But I decided in 84 to retire from screenwriting and write books full time because you have more control. You're kind of the head of the studio and you're the book writer, even though you deal with publishers, et cetera. But publishers generally have more respect for writers than people in Hollywood do. But as I found out in my Capra book, I had tremendous trouble with my publisher, but we'll go into that. But anyway, so then I started interviewing Capra in 84. And I would go down to Palm Springs or La Quinta and talk to him at length. And, uh, uh, as I say, I was really going into minute detail about his upbringing first and foremost. But I was also trying to find out about the making of the films, because simultaneously, I started by interviewing his crew people, Joseph Walker, first of all. Excuse me, because Joe Walker was very elderly and frail, and I thought I better get him on tape. It's kind of a race against the Grim Reaper when you're doing a biography. There were two screenwriters I interviewed during that time, and both died within the next 11 days, for example.
Oh, but yeah, I remember.
But you couldn't do that book now because there were 175 people I interviewed, and I think they're all gone. But
right,
a lot of people. One of his early cameramen was 99 years old. I interviewed this guy, and he was telling me how he knew Jack London. I love talking to elderly people because you learn about a world that before you came along. And he said, "Come over to Hawaii and stay with me." He said, "I have an extra cot." I never did that, but we had a good talk on the phone. But anyway, with Capra, I really. I didn't get to ask him everything I wanted to because he had a series of strokes in August of '85. But so I had a whole year of interviewing him, and it was a testy process because he became difficult to some extent. But I think in some ways he welcomed telling the truth, because I realize it's a terrible burden to live a lie, to be loved for something you're not, which was his dilemma, because he had gone around to college campuses pretending he's a liberal and a lover of humanity. And in fact, I found out he was deeply conservative, reactionary, and a bigot, and a kind of a misanthrope. Ironically, he portrayed himself as a sort of Gandhi-like lover of humanity, but he basically hated everybody. He was equal opportunity bigot. He hated any group you mentioned. He would hate, including his own Italian Americans. He had nothing good to say about them. And at one point, and black people, and he had a shocking streak of anti-Semitism, and he didn't like Native Americans, and you name it. I once said, "What about the Irish?" He said, "Oh, the Irish were the worst." And I said, "Why were they the worst?" He said, "Because they thought this was their country." And what he meant was, and this was in the book on immigration, that the Irish had come over in large numbers and they had jobs, and they were like most ethnic groups kind of resent the new group coming in because there's a struggle for jobs. And there was bitterness on both sides because of that. There was, the Irish were somewhat bigoted toward other groups. But John Ford, by contrast, grew up in a multi-ethnic neighborhood. Well, actually Capra did too, but it made Ford fond of the diversity of America. That's our strength as a country, a nation of immigrants, as JFK called it, although that leaves out Native Americans who were here before all the white people came along and other people. But Capra was so bitter and bigoted. And part of it was his career had tanked after World War II. The first 45 years of his life was tremendously successful. And then the last 45 years was a big failure. His last successful movie, well, even this was a box office failure. It's a Wonderful Life. It is considered a flop financially because it cost a lot of money to make. It was, I think, 3.6 million, which was a lot in those days, and it didn't get the reviews that it has now. Now it has, cult status and everything, but back then people thought it was old-fashioned and cornball, etc. And the film that they were going to that year was The Best Years of Our Lives, which is a really great William Wyler film. But that's a very honest and realistic film about 1946 America, the returning veterans and what kind of society they came into. And Capra is making this very personal fantasy, et cetera, in the public. He had kind of lost his audience. I have a theory about comedy directors. They usually have about a 10-year run where they connect with the zeitgeist. You look at Sturgis, had this remarkable 7-year run where he was just tremendous in the 40s, and Capra in the 30s. And other people like that. The exceptions are Lubitsch he kept reinventing himself throughout his career, and Howard Hawks made films in many genres, but comedy, Buster Keaton was great in the 20s, and then he had trouble when sound came in, and
Yeah.
wasn't totally his fault. And then Chaplin kind of lost his audience, and Capra lost his audience after It's a Wonderful Life. But I read all the projects that he was trying to do until he finally retired in 1960. Well, let's see, in 1966, he finally gave up. And I read these projects, and they were mostly pretty bad. Frankly, I read 11 drafts of Marooned, which he had started directing, and there was a story there, but that was a pretty good script. But a lot of them were really embarrassing projects. And part of it was after the war, when he came back from World War II, he had served the country very loyally, making the Why We Fight films and other films for both the troops and the public. And but he came back, in my opinion, bereft of a creative personality. He had basically turned himself into a tool of the military establishment, and he followed orders very loyally and did whatever they wanted. And he didn't really have much of a personality left. And he came back, he did one good film, It's a Wonderful Life, which is kind of an escapist film in some ways, but it's also kind of a really dark film. It's a fascinating film. But then his career cratered with State of the Union. For example, I talked to George Falsey, who was a cinematographer, and a great cinematographer. He did Lubitsch films and other important films. And he said he was shocked that Capra had no visual sense. This is quite a thing for a cinematographer to say, that Capra didn't seem to know where to put the camera. And I was reminded of Jean-Luc Godard once said, the choice of where to put the camera is a moral choice. That's really true. And also, I was told by Folsey, when they were having the first day of rushes, Spencer Tracy came to the rushes, which he said was very unusual. Tracy never came to rushes, but he thought this was an important film with an important director. And he said they all sat there at the end of the rushes, and they usually wait for the director to say something. And Capra just sat there for minutes on end and didn't say anything. And then he got up and said, "Okay, goodbye." And he said Tracy was really upset, and he never came to rushes again. He just kind of tuned out of the whole thing. Capra didn't know how to talk to actors or writers. And I talked to writers who worked with him, and Ian McClellan Hunter, one of the people he informed on, said, I was kind of stunned that Capra didn't seem to know what we were trying to do with our story. He worked on Roman Holiday that Capra was going to direct, and he said Capra didn't have any ideas. And he said, I admired this guy from the 30s films, and what happened? And well, the reason was partly he wouldn't work with Robert Riskin and Joe Swerling and Sidney Buchman anymore, his three best screenwriters. And it was because they were on the left. Buchman was a member of the Communist Party when he wrote Mr. Smith, which is fascinating. And Capra admitted later, that's the best script I ever had. But he said, and he tried to disassociate himself from that film and that script because Buchman was a communist, and he informed on Buchman. And then Riskin was a liberal anti-communist, but he was a fervent Roosevelt supporter. And he and Capra had a schism because Capra was hogging credit, etc. So he wasn't working with Riskin, who was a great screenwriter. And Joe Swerling worked on Capra films even before Riskin and all the way through It's a Wonderful Life. But he had a falling out with Capra, partly because of Wonderful Life. But even worse, I found out Joe Swerling had a son who was a physicist, and Capra had called the FBI on Swerling's son because he thought he was a communist. I mean, it was false, but he called the FBI on his son, and Swerling was just beside himself, as you could imagine.
Yeah.
And so he really loathed Capra from that point on. So Capra actually said that he would not work with liberal writers anymore after the war. And if you say that, that means you can't work with about 90% of the writers at Hollywood. They're mostly liberals.
Yeah.
He mostly worked with a right-wing nut, Miles Connolly, who was this Catholic right-wing writer who had some talent, but he was kind of demented in some ways, and
Mm.
he kind of fed into Capra's worst instincts, and so they wrote some really some of the projects in the 50s were very goofy. There's one about um, they're putting on the Passion Play in Palm Springs or something, and Jesus comes down or something. I mean, some crazy religious fantasy. Capra found religion after the war
Right.
because he was shattered personality and he needed some mooring, and he'd never been particularly religious. He was raised as a Catholic, but his first wife was Jewish, which is interesting because he later became anti-Semitic, and and she became a Christian Scientist. So Capra became a Christian Scientist. But I asked him, I said, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Well, yeah, but not too strongly." I mean, that's a typical
Mm.
Capra answer. But he and his second wife Lou got remarried in the Catholic Church in 52, and he became this super Catholic guy to kind of help prove that he wasn't a communist. He was,
Right.
it's kind of astonishing and really sad that this guy who was this great lover of America, patriot, was accused of being disloyal after the war.
Yeah.
This was shattering to him, that the government that he loved and worked for kicked him in the teeth, and he reacted with. He became suicidal for a while, and then he wrote this long document called the Security Board File. He was on the staff of a Defense Department think tank at Caltech called Project Vista, which was this top secret think tank of a lot of scientists and other people planning World War III in Europe if the Soviets invaded Europe, which is kind of interesting in light of what's happening now. But
Yeah.
their ideas were kind of crackpot. I actually got their report declassified. This tells you some stories about documents. I went to the National Archives and I said, "Hi, I'd like to see the report of Project Vista." And the archivist said, "Well, it's classified." This is like in mid 80s. But he said, if you come back this afternoon, we'll let you read it, and you can we'll send you a copy. So I declassified Project Vista. By then it was, not top secret, but it had all kinds of stuff about nuclear warfare that they didn't want people to know at the time. But Capra was the head of the motion picture branch, and he was planning some propaganda operations, and he wrote some papers. He was going to kind of do the Cold War version of the Why We Fight films. But one of his ideas was, I don't know where he got it from, but in foreign countries to project large images of the cross on clouds. Right? I mean, that's how insane this stuff got.
Oh, wow.
So he was okay. So he's a project consultant for this thing, and they had to have a top secret security clearance, which he had during the war. He had the highest security clearance, the Q clearance. But after the war, he had to be able to see classified documents on nuclear war and all this. And the Army intelligence people thought he was a possible security. Possibly disloyal, and which was crazy because nobody was more patriotic. However, they finally gave him a letter with the charges against him, most of which were ridiculous. For example, they said in World War II you received considerable amount of propaganda material direct from Russia. Well, Russia was our ally, first of all, in World War II. And he made the Battle of Russia, which is probably the best of the Why We Fight films. And it's very pro.
They must have all had amnesia, those guys.
Yeah, I mean, after the war, and this was one of the absurdities of the HUAC hearings and the Blacklist, anybody who had made a pro-Russian film during the war, like Mission to Moscow and Song of Russia, had to apologize for it because, they were called premature anti-fascists, which is a wonderful Orwellian phrase. People who were anti-fascist too early were suspicious, But so Capra was very anxious about the Battle of Russia. That's the only film of his that he and I watched together. He made a point of showing it to me because he was proud of it on the one hand, because it's got tremendous battle footage, but on the other hand, he was kind of anxious about it. And but the one charge in his the critique that they made against him was he had worked with a lot of left-wing writers, which was true. And I counted, there were maybe 20 to 25 writers he had worked with who were on the left, and either liberals or communists even. And that was true. And one of the good things about him, and I heard this from his secretary, Chester Stitch, he was maybe my best source. He had been Capra's personal secretary for 39 years. And part of my advice for biographers is find the secretary, because they really know everything about you. And Chet was willing to talk to me, partly because Capra unceremoniously fired him late in life with 2 weeks notice and no pension.
Yeah,
after
God.
39 years. Wow. And so Chet was willing to tell me almost everything. There was one area that he kind of kept hidden, but he said, in his prime, what made Capra great was that he worked with a wide range of people, from communists to far right people in the middle. He had a brain trust, and he would assimilate ideas from all over, and then he would kind of funnel it into his films. And that's why his films, there's a book I remember reviewing for Variety by Donald Willis on Capra in the 70s. And he said, Capra's films sometimes seem communistic, sometimes fascistic, sometimes liberal, sometimes conservative. And he kind of threw up his hands because he couldn't figure out why. Well, the thing that people had never factored in was Capra didn't write these things. Right. He had some input into the writing, but they were the products mainly of his liberal or leftist screenwriters. And the fact that a communist wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a wonderful sort of irony. And I asked a friend of Sidney Buchman who wrote it, I said, how could a communist write the greatest American patriotic film? And he said, well, he was an American communist. I thought that's a great quote. But actually that was true. And, the slogan of the American Communist Party in the late 30s was "Communism is 20th century Americanism."
Right.
And they were mainly concerned at that point of trying to get the public to support the coming war against fascism, against Hitler, because they knew it was coming. The American public was reluctant to go to war, and Roosevelt was trying to get the public to recognize the danger. But so they were stressing the principles of the Bill of Rights, and they were not stressing things that would alienate people. And the Bill of Rights is what Mr. Smith is all about. That's one reason I love that film. But it's also a very strong critique of the corruption of American politics. And it's this, it shows that most of the Congress is corrupt, and there's a newspaper publishing tycoon who runs the state that Mr. Smith comes from, and he's this kind of innocent guy who goes to Washington, and he's idealistic, and the guy his antagonist is a real fascist played by Edward Arnold, and it's quite a powerful film, and great film. And Capra tried to disown it, as I said. Like, I found a transcript of he went to a lot of film festivals in later years too. In Mexico City in '82, he was on a panel on political films with Costa Gabras, the guy who made Z and A State of Siege.
Oh, yeah.
Great political filmmaker. And Capra was saying, don't make political films, because if you do, he said, you divide yourself in half and you divide the audience in half. Half the audience will not go to your film. And right. Costa Gabras was shocked. He said, how could you say this? You made the greatest political film ever, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. How could you say this? And that was a common reaction. People, when they met Capra, if he told the truth about something, they'd say, what? Who is this guy?
Right.
And so Capra had a hard time after the war explaining why he worked with all these leftist writers. And so he wrote this thing called the Security Board file, because the Army, Navy, Air Force Personnel Security Board was the clearance agency that handled military clearances in those days, like giving people clearances to work on this Project Vista, and they were the ones who denied Capra his security clearance and caused him to totally freak out. And he sat down with Chet Stitch, and Capra wrote it's something like 225-page book, in effect, about his life, which he called the Security Board File. And I read that when I went to Wesleyan University in 1981, when I was researching the AFI tribute to Capra. Capra had donated his papers. Now this gets us into the frankly unmasking Frank Capra territory. He had donated his papers to Wesleyan University. And I called up Janine Basinger, who's still a well-known film historian, and she was a big Frank Capra admirer and fan. And I said, I'm writing the show. Can I come there and look at his papers? And she said, well, they haven't been opened yet, but I'll open them for you. You'll be the first person to see Frank's papers. I said, great. And she seemed very cooperative and nice. And so with my reporter's instinct, I zeroed in on this period of 1951 when he went to the Indian Film Festival. I thought there was some possible revelation there. I said, can I have the box for 1951? And within about half an hour, I found the story. I found his security board file, and I read that day, and it revealed that he was an informer in the Blacklist period, and that was a huge story that nobody knew. As you said, Kazan was infamous or celebrated by some people and damned by other people for being an informer. And he was very different from Capra because he was open about it. At first, Kazan had a private session with HUAC, and he said, I'm not going to name names because that was the dividing line between, some people, if they were accused, they'd say, well, okay, I used to be a communist, but I'm not anymore, and I'm sorry, and they would get cleared. But other people chose the path of naming names, turning in their friends to save their own skin. And Kazan, after a period of soul searching and anguish, decided to inform on his colleagues and went public with it. And then he even took out an ad in the New York Times boasting about it and went through all of his films and plays and said, this is.
And he never showed any remorse, even in his memoir later.
Well, he did and he didn't. I mean, he's a very interesting figure because his autobiography is really fascinating.
It's great. Yeah, it really is.
It's like Capra's, but see, I haven't studied Kazan to the extent I studied Capra, but I mean, Kazan's a great director, but as Orson Welles was asked at the Cinémathèque Française in 1982, some young woman said, what do you think of Kazan? And Welles's face kind of clouded over and he said, cher mademoiselle, you have asked about the wrong metteur en scène. And he said, Elia Kazan,
traitor, right?
Yeah. Elia Kazan is one of our greatest directors, but he's also a traitor because
it's on YouTube. I'm sure you know that, but
he said he sold all his colleagues to McCarthy. Well, there were a couple of mistakes in that statement. First of all, McCarthy had nothing to do with the Hollywood blacklist. That's the common fallacy. But Kazan,
I only found that out a couple of years ago interviewing an author on a book on the blacklist. I always thought McCarthy was like the ringleader and in control of all that, but he was not, which I did not know. Interesting.
House Committee on Un-American Activities, sometimes called the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, was formed in 1938. And the leading guy was Martin Gang, who was a right-wing Texas legislator. And he went after the film industry in a kind of ludicrous way. Like he accused Shirley Temple of being a communist. That was the most, and she was still a child actor, but she had sent birthday greetings. She had sent anniversary greetings to a French communist newspaper. And and so that made the committee a laughingstock. And Variety said, who's going to be accused next? Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, And but he held hearings in Hollywood in 1940 and interviewed a few people and made Hollywood nervous. And during the war, the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which is another Orwellian name, they were rabid right-wingers. They formed this organization to run the communists out of Hollywood. And there were a fair number of communists in the guilds. It was largely a labor issue, And during the war, organized labor to support the war effort tabled strikes. They said, we will not strike until after the war. We're going to, because that would disrupt the war. So after the war, they all started saying, okay, now let's get the benefits we deserve. And so there was a furious right-wing reaction. And HUAC in 1947 had its most famous Hollywood hearings in Washington, where they had the people who were known as the Hollywood 10, who were 10 mostly screenwriters, but producer and a director. And Bertolt Brecht was the 11th, and he left for Germany right after that. But these 10 people were the first people blacklisted, and the studios instituted the blacklist, not the government, because blacklisting was illegal. I found a secret document interesting in December 47, when the guilds were trying to figure out how to deal with the blacklist. Ronald Reagan was representing the Screen Actors Guild. He was the president.
Yeah.
And he said blacklisting is illegal in the state of California, and it's un-American, and we should fight it. And he was a friendly witness before HUAC, which means he went there and supported their anti-communist crusade. But he also said, in America, under the First Amendment, we all have the right to belong to any party we want. And right. the distinction is you can have any political belief you want. It's very important we have that, but you cannot take action to overthrow the government. That's the dividing line. And there was a Supreme Court decision in, I think it was 1971, where H. Rap Brown, who was a black activist, got up at a rally and said, I hope Richard Nixon gets assassinated. And the Supreme Court ruled that he had the right to say that as long as he didn't take action to do it. That's the thing. So anyway, but Reagan was secretly an FBI informer while he was supporting the Bill of Rights, which is part of the whole story. So anyway, Capra panicked because they started looking into him, and he fled Hollywood at that point. I discovered this was a story he wasn't really honest about in his book. He was developing Roman Holiday and Friendly Persuasion, which were two films later made by William Wyler, who was his partner in the post-war Liberty Films. Capra, Wyler, George Stevens, and Sam Briskin formed this company to make films, and Capra made It's a Wonderful Life, and the company soon fell apart. But Capra, in the uncut version of his autobiography, which I read at Wesleyan, he admitted a lot of things that were removed from the book. His editor on the book, I found correspondence saying, why don't you take out a lot of that political stuff, Frank? This will confuse people or bother people. And so they took out stuff like Capra said, the reason I dropped Roman Holiday and Friendly Persuasion was their writers were accused of being communists, and he informed on Michael Wilson, who was a young ex-Marine who wrote the screenplay for Friendly Persuasion and was a communist for a while. And then the other project, Roman Holiday, was supposedly written by Ian McClellan Hunter, who was a communist, and I interviewed him. But he told me it was really written by Dalton Trumbo, who was one of the Hollywood 10, and he was fronting for Dalton Trumbo. And now Trumbo has the credit because the Writers Guild gave Trumbo credit. But he said, could you imagine if Capra knew that Dalton had written that screenplay? He would have gone bananas. Because Trumbo was the most prominent Hollywood communist, along with John Howard Lawson. But anyway, so Capra dropped these projects because their writers were accused of being communist. And then he fled Hollywood. He had a ranch in Fallbrook, which is Southern California. It's a avocado ranch. And he gave up on the film business, he thought, for a while, and he moved down to Fallbrook, and he tried to be a farmer for years. And that didn't work out very well, and he was kind of bored, according to Chet Stitch, who he persuaded to move down there with him. And Chet said, you can't really get very excited sitting around watching avocados growing, And so Capra then made a couple films in the early 50s, and very bad films. And then he worked on the Bell Science series for television, which he told me he actually hated doing these children's science shows. He thought it was a big come down. Although in his book, he says they were wonderful. He was kind of an educator in a way. And one of the themes of my book was that he was trained to be a scientist. And he told me in a very striking admission that he should have stayed in science. He would have been a lot happier. And I told that to Carlton Moss, who was a screenwriter who wrote The Negro Soldier. Moss was an African-American, terrific man. And he said, Capra said that he wished he stayed in science. And he said, wow, that's amazing. You got that out of him. And under the influence of Moss, I put that at the end of the book, my discussion with Capra.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's right at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. And Capra said, and I said to him, well, why didn't you stay in science? And he said, well, I think it was the audience that kept me in, because when you go to a movie theater and you hear people laughing at your movies, that's what kept me in. Otherwise, right. I wish I would have been a lot happier if I'd been a scientist. But anyway, so Capra, after the war, tried to give up on movies, and then he went back in the late 50s and made a sort of a feeble comeback, and he made two bad movies, A Hole in the Head and Pocketful of Miracles, which is terrible. But he had so many projects that failed, and most of them had religious themes, like lives of various saints and strange stories. You could tell that Hollywood was embarrassed by these things, and he was trying to make Bible movies, and Bible movies were popular in the 50s, but the ones he was promoting were not the kind that it wasn't the Ten Commandments. It was a story of Joseph and his brethren and things like that. But he wanted to work with Elvis Presley. That would have been interesting. Some of these projects were kind of interesting. He wanted to make a movie in which Elvis plays a rock singer who becomes a demagogue, political demagogue, corrupting the youth of America. And Colonel Parker turned that down, maybe wisely, But Capra turned that into a novel that hardly anybody has read, called Cry Wilderness. It came out a few years ago. It's really, really terrible. But he was such a bad writer. But anyway, but he then, he was very unhappy in the kind of new Hollywood in the 50s. But he had lost his mojo. He lost his creative spark because he was afraid of ideas and political themes primarily. Like in the 30s, he was a social critic. His films were somewhat socially critical, but they had conservative elements. But Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Lost Horizon, Mr. Smith, You Can't Take It With You, they Meet John Doe, they had political elements, and he was terrified of that stuff. So he didn't have any interesting ideas, except, maybe this Elvis thing might have been interesting, but it probably would have been a fiasco. But anyway, it's a sad come down for Capra, what happened to him later.
Oh, it really is a tragedy, and ultimately. And one thing I'm also curious about, just going back a bit before we get into the struggles you had to publish the book, is it's very interesting. He didn't have much of a visual style, and he really left that to Joe Walker, and of course how much the major contributions from screenwriters and the crews and everything. I was very interested in the fact that you talked about that he used multiple cameras because he was in. I think that's ultimately, I'm sure, a big reason why the acting is always so good in his films. I mean, every single actor. Because I've seen most of his movies, and I watched a bunch again recently, and down to the smallest parts. I mean, everyone really pops. Everyone's really distinctive and alive and spontaneous, and that multiple cameras must have been a big help. And he seemed to be very sensitive to what actors needed, and I thought that was extraordinary. So. Was he very particular about, like you talked about how in State of the Union, like the deal, he didn't even know where to put the camera. Was he very particular about where to put the camera? And then even in the editing, I mean, what was his relationship like with how these films were cut?
Yeah, the cutting in his films is very dynamic until after the war it gets very lethargic, which is interesting. In Hole in the Head, I felt when I watched it over and over again, I'd seen it when I actually, my 12th birthday party, I took my little friends to see A Hole in the Head, and we were throwing popcorn and stuff. But I wanted
to see it. I didn't get a chance to see it before today, but I I'm sure you've heard of the Safdie brothers, who are very popular now, and they made this film Uncut Gems, which is really good with Adam Sandler. And on the Criterion Channel, they asked them some of their favorite films, and they said A Hole in the Head. I was like, really? And the guy didn't even know what he's like. What is that? He's like, oh, it's Frank Capra and Frank Sinatra. He's like, what? And I don't think anyone really knows it.
Well, it has some virtues because Sinatra's really good in the film, and the little boy Eddie Hodges is wonderful. It's a father-son story. It's about a ne'er-do-well father and his son, and Edward G. Robinson, great actor, is in it, and the great Thelma Ritter. But Capra always puts the camera in the wrong place, always, infallibly, and that to me is a sign of what Godard said, that choosing the camera position is a moral choice, and he'd lost his sense of morals, or his, in the deepest sense, like. In Noel Coward's Private Lives, somebody mentions morals, and somebody says, "What does that mean?" He says, "Well, what one should do and what one shouldn't do." Right, and I found some notes in Michael Wilson's papers, this blacklisted writer who Capra informed on, and he said, "Why do informers have to make themselves out to be idiots?" That was a really interesting comment. And Capra made himself out to be an idiot in later years because he was, there's this phrase "useful idiot" that sometimes people use if somebody's a tool of communists, a useful idiot. But he was kind of a useful idiot of the American establishment. He was trying to be, but he was even inept at that. He couldn't, get traction. But your question, I kind of lost track of.
Just like
the actors.
Yeah. Well, the camera placement. I'm just curious because at that point after the war, it sounds like you said, he didn't even know where to put it. But what about before? Was he good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't. As I say, looking at his 20s films, the Harry Langdon comedies, for example, are well, Strongman is a really good film, but Long Pants is a very weird failure, and he got fired off that, and it's a whole story in itself. But they're not distinguished visually in terms of lighting and stuff. But when Joe Walker comes along, suddenly there's a lot of texture in the lighting, and Joe was famous for photographing women and made them look great. Like Barbara Stanwyck was kind of an unusual looking person, and had trouble becoming a star because nobody could quite know what to do with her unusual qualities, which proved very durable. But it was Capra who recognized her qualities, and I interviewed her, and she thought Capra was the guy who made her whole career. But Joe Walker was the guy who figured out how to photograph her and made her look beautiful. And Jean Arthur too. Some of the best stars are kind of odd looking people, and that's part of stardom, I think, because if you're a perfect looking person, that's what you see on TV shows. They have all these perfect, beautiful people.
I completely agree.
And they're kind of bland, usually. This is a broad generalization, but the great movie stars often have some oddness. There's a famous
distinctive
quote. Yeah, there's a famous quote from somebody who said, "There is no great beauty that hath not some strangeness."
Right.
Like Greta Garbo, maybe the most beautiful actress, was kind of androgynous and had unusual features and things. And Katharine Hepburn, unusual looking person, But Capra was a tremendous audience. And in my Cukor book, George Cukor's People, which is focused on his work with actors, I went deeply into acting, which isn't written about a lot in film history. But Cukor said, and Orson Welles said this too, that Welles said the director is simply the audience. He supplies what's missing from the making of a motion picture is the audience. Like when you're on the stage, you get the immediate feedback from they laugh or they don't laugh, and But in a movie, you have the crew, but they're not supposed to laugh because it would be disruptive. But Capra there's a wonderful picture of Capra sitting on the set of You Can't Take It With You with Jean Arthur, his favorite actress, and Lionel Barrymore's in the middle, and Capra's on the left. I think he's sitting on an apple box, and he has a wonderful smile. Capra had this wonderful smile, and she's looking at him. And, she was a notoriously insecure actress, great actress, but anxious. And he made her come alive. And having been in many documentaries, I remember a couple documentaries directed by Nick Redmond and Sam Pollard, where I felt really comfortable. And Julie Kirgo, who is a longtime friend of mine, was interviewing me in Becoming John Ford. And when you look at Sam Pollard or Julie Kirgo, I was a better interview subject. And looking at you, I feel that rapport too, because you understand what I'm talking about, and it's not like a struggle, and we have a rapport, and that makes people better. And so that's what Cukor and Wells both said. What a director does, they kind of select moments and guide people in different ways. And working with Wells for 5 years as an actor on the other side of the wind was my film school, in a sense. And I was not an actor. He put me in because he wanted me to play kind of a spoof of myself as an earnest young film critic. And but that is a very diverse cast of Oscar winners, and John Huston, who's a fabulous actor, but he was a director as well. And then some non-actors. Wells liked a mixture. And I could see he treated everybody differently. That's one of the tricks or reasons for a good director is you don't direct everybody the same way. And I'll tell you a great story. Hank Worden, who people remember from Ford movies, he's Old Mose in The Searchers. He's this kind of eccentric character actor, wonderful, funny guy. And he was in The Alamo, which was directed by John Wayne, and he was in a lot of Ford movies. I said, what was the difference between John Ford and John Wayne as directors? And Hank said, well, I'll tell you. He said, Ford yelled at Wayne all the time and really was tough on Wayne and kind of abused him, but Wayne is so strong, he took it, because he knew that Ford was a great director, and it didn't intimidate Wayne, but it got the results that Ford wanted. And so Wayne, he said, unfortunately, thought that was the way to direct everybody, is yell at them. And so on The Alamo, he yelled at me all the time. And he said, I'm a sensitive kind of guy, and if somebody yells at me, I freeze up. And he says, I don't think I'm very good in The Alamo for that reason. I'm tense, Whereas he said, Ford treated me like a baby. He cajoled the performance out of Hank, and that's a big difference. And so a director is a psychologist and everything else, and you say what the actor needs, but you kind of guide them, and sometimes they need gentle handling, sometimes harsh handling. And I saw that with Wells toward me, but toward other people as well. And to me, the greatest moment of watching Wells direct was John Huston comes into the party scene in The Other Side of the Wind, and he has appropriated this 16-year-old blonde girl from Peter Bogdanovich's character. That scene was not in the final version of the film. Peter was one of the producers, and I think he didn't want that in there, but it's not explained why this 16-year-old girl shows up at the party. But Huston, in a crude sexual power play, takes the girl away from Peter and walks into the party. And in the scene, I was watching this being filmed, and there were a lot of extras around, and Huston was supposed to kind of smile and kind of make a kind of leering look at the girl, and I could tell when he did it, it was overdone. It was too much. It was crude, And then I thought, what's Wells going to say? Because he treated Huston with kid gloves because he was his peer, equal status as a director and a good actor. And you don't want to humiliate John Huston in front of a bunch of actors, So Wells kind of paused, and then he said, John, who you remind me of in this scene? And Huston said, who, Orson? And Wells said, your father. And his father was the great actor Walter Huston, and Wells had directed him on the radio. And Huston beamed, because whenever he mentioned his father, he beamed because he loved him, And he said, oh, really, Orson? Why? And Wells said, well, he had that kindly paternal air, but nobody ever had a higher score. And then Huston roared with laughter. And that was such a great piece of direction. He didn't tell him, tone it down, have a little irony. But then Huston did the line so wonderfully. He had that kindly paternal air, but there was lechery involved, and it was subtle, and it was wonderful, and it was funny. And that's a great director. And Capra did that kind of thing. I'll tell you another little story that Edward Burns told me that really is indicative of Capra. He thought Ed said actors were everything in Capra films. everything was geared to make the actor happy and working well. And Capra, he said, kept a series of big spikes on the floor next to his chair, those big metal things that they use on the set. And if an actor flubbed a line, Capra would drop the spike behind him and it would go boing, and then he'd say, what? And he'd turn around and look at the crew and he said, who did that? And they all knew that this was done just to take the onus off the actor so the actor didn't feel criticized. And they didn't take it personally because they're all, loyal. They understood what he was doing. But the actor then was not humiliated. And then Capra would say, okay, we got to do it again. And then Gene Arthur would do the line the right way, things like that.
I can't help but wonder if, because as you know, and you quoted John Cassavetes in Catastrophe of Success, Capra was his favorite filmmaker, and he when you wrote about the multiple camera setups and not having strict marks, and I thought, oh my, that's very much what John did. I can't help but wonder if he knew that about Capra as well. I don't know.
I bet he did.
He must have. Yeah.
He made a profound comment about Capra. He said, maybe there really wasn't an America. Maybe it was only Frank Capra. And that's so ironic because, the America that exists in Capra films is sort of the way we would like it to be, but it really isn't. Yeah,
idealist. Yeah.
And Capra, his fans think they hold him up as something he's not. But to get back, to Cassavetes' point, Jimmy Stewart, one of the few things I could not figure out what to say in 7.5 years I spent on this book was what to say about Jimmy Stewart's great performance in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's so great.
Yeah.
I racked my brain. I couldn't think of anything intelligent to say. And then years later, I read a quote from Wells where he said, Jimmy Stewart's performance is beyond praise. And I thought, wow, that's great.
When they go to that close up of him as he's towards the end, as he's looks through the garbage dump of all the letters that supposedly were written in telling him to stop, and then he just looks up at Gene Arthur, and it's so quiet that he looks so helpless that, my God, it hits you right in the gut. The look of helplessness on his face. I thought, how did he get that? How did he find that? It's again, the acting in his films is extraordinary. And speaking of John Huston, I hadn't seen American Madness before. With Walter Huston, and I couldn't believe the similarities with It's a Wonderful Life. And you talked about, Capra would always say, well, I made great films without Riskin. Look at It's a Wonderful Life, but you look at it and they clearly took that whole thing with the bank and saving the bank that we all know from It's a Wonderful Life from American Madness. There's so many, the suicide, and there's so many. I think It's a Wonderful Life, in my view, is a much more interesting film. But American Madness, it's a great, really good movie with strong similarities. So there was that formula, that.
Yeah, I'll go into that in a minute because you're getting into some real key areas about Capra's work. But let me just pick up on your multiple camera thing because it's important too.
Oh, yeah.
Capra didn't, in his early work through It Happened One Night, was very economical, and he shot fast. He didn't waste film. He didn't waste money. And then suddenly, one reason I call it the catastrophe of success, Tennessee Williams used that phrase for what happened to him after the Glass Menagerie, that you think success is what you work for your whole life and it should be wonderful, but actually it caused him all kinds of problems psychologically and socially and everything. And it's a profound observation. But that's what happened with Capra after It Happened One Night. He was the kind of happy-go-lucky director up to a point. As Chet Stitch told me, between films, Capra was racked with anguish and insecurity and doubt, but on the set, he was confident. But then he became really anxious because he suddenly realized, as he said once, people in the interior of China know who you are. Yeah, that's a great comment. Like, people are paying attention to what I'm doing, and that happens to some people. That success can destroy them, is what happened
Yeah.
with Capra. But so then on Mr. Deeds, he went over budget, and he started using too much film. And then Lost Horizon was I didn't use this phrase in my first book because it's anachronistic, but it's Capra's Heaven's Gate.
Right.
Because he shot so much film that he actually was in danger of bankrupting Columbia Pictures. They ran out of money, and he went wild with shooting. Like, there's a dinner table scene where he covered it. He had multiple cameras covering every possible angle. He had hours of footage on a scene that was fairly simple, that 3 years earlier he could have shot fast. And the High Lama scenes, he shot something like 6 hours of footage or something. It's just crazy. And the film was a huge disaster in many ways. Harry Cohn took Capra off the picture and recut the picture because Capra wanted to release it in a 3.5-hour version, had a bad preview, and Capra kind of didn't know what to do with this big film. It was a big white elephant, and Cohn got rid of him and cut the film, and Capra sued him. And anyway, that was the turning point of Capra's career. But on Mr. Smith, when Jimmy Stewart gives his tremendous speeches in the Senate, some of the best acting you'll ever see, he used multiple cameras. He had like 5 cameras. I interviewed Stewart and Walker and everybody. And he had a camera on Stewart. He had cameras on some of the senators. He had a wide shot. He had a Harry Carey, the president of the Senate, camera, And Jimmy Stewart said, I didn't actually know where the camera was after a while. I was just doing the scene, And it was... I kind of forgot about the camera, and he said that was great because I just was doing the scene. And there is a quote that I use in my Q-Corp book that Capra, when he did our tribute to Jimmy Stewart, the AFI tribute, he wrote his own little speech. It was great. I remember he read it to us over the phone, George and I, and Lee Strasberg, of all people, later said this was the best definition of film acting he had ever read. Capra said about Stewart on our AFI tribute, a film faces the audience with a single thin front line, the actors. If that front line collapses, the show is over. A bad performance can kill the finest story. Yes, there is bad acting and good acting, fine performances, sometimes great performances, but there is a higher level than great performances in acting, a level where there is no acting at all. The actor disappears and there's only a real live person on the screen, a person audiences care about immediately. There are only a few actors, very few, capable of achieving this highest level of the actor's art. And then he pointed at Stewart and he says, and that tall string bean sitting right over there, he's one of them. So that's part of the secret of so many cameras, and Jimmy Stewart got wrapped up in the scene and felt he was really doing it. And Capra's camera is like documentary observation, and that's why the performance is so great. But let me just say, I know we're running short on time, but you mentioned to the listeners that I had trouble getting this book out. That's why I wrote the book, frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra, which you see behind me. Janine Basinger, who is Capra's archivist, they have his papers at Wesleyan University. I said she was very cooperative at first, and she promised I could use Capra's unpublished writings and all that. And then she started reneging on that. And I made the mistake of telling her I discovered that he was an informer, and then suddenly everything kind of changed. And then she insinuated herself with my editor, who was the famous Robert Gottlieb at Knopf, who, edited Robert Caro's books and Bill Clinton's autobiography and Katharine Graham's, a legendary great editor. And I felt, pleased and honored to be there. But Janine Basinger and Gottlieb, who's now dead, became friends, and they started trying to, it's a long story, 600-page book, very well documented because I kept paper trail and everything. And my lawyer's suggestion, write everything down. They started trying to sabotage my book, and part of it was getting Capra, not totally turning against me, because I think he felt good unburdening himself, and confession is good for the soul in the Catholic religion, even though that's one reason I left the church, partly because it's so traumatic to confess. But I think he felt he was getting it off his chest. But also he was very anxious, and he would lie to me a lot, and it became like a game. I would have to go to other people and get the true story. Then I'd come back to him and he would tell me the truth. But anyway, behind the scenes, Janine Basinger and Gottlieb were scheming to either stop the book from coming out or to gut the book. And she was going to edit the book surreptitiously. And, I had to be like a detective in finding out what was going on and cut out, they kind of were going to co-opt this book and turn it into a sanitized version of what I had discovered, because it upsets the whole Capra myth that her archive at Wesleyan revolves around to some extent, because it shows him as, a right-wing Republican informer, et cetera, credit hog, and things that his fans didn't realize, and some today even are stubbornly refusing to accept. Anyway, to make a long story short, it took me 4 years of legal battling. I was trying to get Knopf to publish the book, and I realized at a certain point they weren't going to publish it, or they were going to publish a sanitized version and get rid of me and edit the book on their own with her. And I won the battle thanks to a great lawyer named Maury Mealy, who's now gone, and my wife Ruth O'Hara, who's associate dean at Stanford. She was tremendously helpful and courageous and very smart. She could have been a great lawyer as well as film critic, and she helped me. But it was a terrible struggle. But I won the battle, got the book out. But I had to go to another publisher. I found an honest publisher and editor, Simon and Schuster, and the editor Bob Bender. They took on the book. It took me a year just to get the book transferred from Knopf to Simon and Schuster, and I had to repay part of my advance, which really galled me under the circumstances. But anyway, then I had to cut out Capra's unpublished writings, except the stuff he did when he worked for the U.S. government, because that's public domain. But I think it helped the book because, frankly, I'm a better writer than Frank Capra. So I the lawyer at Random House gave me just one good piece of advice when I used the word paraphrase. He said, not paraphrase, summarize. In other words, paraphrasing is too close to the original, but summarizing is what you do. And so there were a couple of adverse court decisions that came along that really hurt writers. It used to be you could use unpublished writings more freely, but you can't. Anyways, and the book was terribly long. When I took it to Simon & Schuster, Bob Bender said it would be the longest book we ever published, and it's just too long. And so I cut 130,000 words, but I think I improved the book. And, there's only one little thing that I missed, but I put that into Frankly. So anyway, when people read Frankly, I think it's quite a story. It's very dramatic, and it shows you how hard it is to tell the truth about a major American figure and how much opposition writers run into when you try to tell the truth. And I did succeed in with the help of the people I mentioned, but tremendous opposition to telling the truth about Capra. But now I'm very proud of having done so, and both books are very revealing of this fascinating guy. Gottlieb told me at one point, he said, Frank Capra is the most interesting man in the world. And that kind of helped sustain me. He was a very interesting man.
Yeah.
And his films, I'm still a fan of his films because I know more about them. I kind of appreciate them more, even though they have flaws, but I appreciate his strengths. But anyway, it's been great talking to you about Capra.
No, you as well. And I mean, I should have figured that 2 books need 2 episodes. So especially with such a big subject. So we'll certainly have to, because I had some more questions about Frankly Unmasking. So we'll have to schedule something soon for a follow-up. But you have a new book coming out shortly, George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director. When is that? When is the exact release date? December?
Well, it's officially December 17th, but It should arrive by December
There we go.
6th. It's from, there's Kukar, and you can't see her, but Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant making Sylvia Scarlett.
Yeah.
It's coming out from Columbia University Press December 6th. And I really had a wonderful time writing this book because it's a study of the performances of a lot of his best actors, stars, and so-called character actors too, and really a deep dig into how a director works with actors. He's one of the greatest actors, directors, along with Wells and Kazan and Max Ophuls and Renoir. I'd say I think those are the best actors, directors in cinema. But it's an experiment in film criticism because actors are. It's hard to write about film acting to some extent, but I think my work with Wells and writing scripts with, and rehearsing actors and things, I found it was easier to write than I expected because I had the vocabulary to do it. And I had a lot of fun watching Kukar's marvelous films, Sylvia Scarlett, Holiday, Camille, Star is Born, one of my favorite films. So anyway, I think people will enjoy that book a lot.
Great. Well, I have a copy, so I look forward to reading it. And of course, we'll schedule something to have you back to talk about that one. And I know, frankly, and I mean, Catastrophe of Success, I know came out in 92, and then another one came out in 2000. But where can people, is that easy to still find today?
Yeah, I expanded the book in 2000 when I got his FBI files and some other files that I'd been trying to get for years. It was published by the University Press of Mississippi in 2012, and it's available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and frankly was self-published, like several of my books that are really kind of unusual books that are a company called Vervante, which is a fulfillment house, is print on demand, and frankly you can get, but it's exclusively sold through Amazon and this company Vervante, but you can get them through Amazon. Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra is from Amazon. But anyway, but the Kukar book is Columbia University Press, with whom I've done books on Billy Wilder and Ernst Lubitsch. Great.
Fantastic. Well, we will schedule a part 2 sometime soon. But Joseph, thank you again for your generosity with your time and talking for a couple of hours about these fantastic books, certainly. So I highly recommend anyone who's a fan of Capra or film history to get both books, because they're really something. I mean, I can't even put it into words. They really are quite shocking, but they'll help you to appreciate his films much more. As a lover of Capra, certainly I like his films even much more now. So thank you for that, Joseph, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you, Robert. I'm always thrilled to be on your show because you really probe deeply into the heart of the material, and I'm glad you had that reaction after reading the book, that you appreciate his films more, which I do too. Yeah. The more you know about films and the filmmakers, you appreciate what they do and what they don't do. Yeah. Anyway, great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching, and thank you again, and I will see you in the next episode.